In the year 1095, when autumn mists clung to castle walls like the breath of ghosts and the harvest moon cast silver shadows across muddy courtyards, there existed a particular kind of restlessness that seemed to seep into the very stones of Europe. It was a restlessness born not of adventure or noble purpose, but of the peculiar ennui that settles over those who have been trained for war in times of peace, like swords kept too long in their sheaths, growing dull from disuse. Picture, if you will, a knight in this twilight hour of the 11th century, standing at the narrow window of his tower, gazing out over lands that stretch endlessly under the pale sky. His armor hangs silent in the corner, polished to mirror brightness not from recent battle, but from the tedious hours spent maintaining what has become more symbol than tool. His destrier stamps restlessly in the stable below, muscles grown soft from too much grain and too little purpose, while in the great hall, the same stories are told again and again around fires that seem to burn lower each night. This was the world into which Pope Urban II spoke his fateful words at Clermont, words that would ripple outward like stones cast into still water, reaching every castle, every manor house, every humble cottage where young men dreamed of something greater than the endless cycle of planting and harvest, of petty disputes over boundary stones and inheritance rights. The Pope's message was simple yet profound, a call that seemed to answer the very restlessness that had been building in Christian hearts like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. But what drove these men to answer such a call? Was it truly the promise of spiritual salvation, the chance to walk where Christ himself had walked, or was it something deeper and more human, the ancient hunger for purpose that has driven explorers and adventurers since the dawn of time? Perhaps it was both, intertwined like the golden threads in a tapestry, impossible to separate the sacred from the profane, the holy from the desperately human. Consider the young knight, third son of a minor lord, whose inheritance consists of little more than his horse, his sword, and the fading echo of his grandfather's battlefield glory. For him, the crusade represents not just a spiritual journey, but a chance to carve his own legend from the raw stone of possibility. He envisions himself returning home with treasures beyond imagining, with stories that will be told around fires for generations, with the kind of glory that transforms a forgotten third son into a name whispered with reverence. Or think of the peasant, bent low over furrows that seem to stretch forever, whose world extends no further than the next valley, who has never tasted food seasoned with anything more exotic than salt, who has never seen a building taller than his lord's modest keep. For him, the promise of pilgrimage offers something even more precious than salvation, the chance to see what lies beyond the horizon, to discover that the world is larger and stranger and more wonderful than he had ever dared to imagine. These were the souls who began to gather as winter gave way to spring in the year 1096, streaming along ancient Roman roads like rivers converging toward the sea. They came on foot and on horseback, alone and in great companies, carrying banners that snapped in the wind like prayers made visible. Some wore the finest mail money could buy, while others carried nothing more than farming tools and the faith that God would provide. The sight of these great processions must have been something to behold, a living river of humanity flowing eastward, carrying with it all the hopes and dreams and desperate hungers of an entire age. Imagine standing on a hilltop and watching them pass below, the morning sun catching on metal and cloth, the sound of thousands of voices raised in song drifting up like incense, the dust of their passage hanging in the air long after they have disappeared around the bend in the road. Yet even as they marched with such apparent purpose, how many of them truly understood what they were walking toward? The Holy Land existed in their minds not as a real place of stone and sand and blazing sun, but as something from illuminated manuscripts, a mystical realm where angels might appear at any moment, and where every stone told a story from the Gospels. They carried with them the Europe they knew, the familiar rhythms of seasonal change, the comfortable certainty of knowing one's place in the great chain of being, the assumption that foreign lands would be merely variations on familiar themes. How could they have prepared themselves for what awaited them? How could anyone raised on the cool mists of northern forests and the gentle rain of European summers imagine the brutal heat of the Syrian desert, where the sun beats down like a hammer on an anvil and the very air seems to shimmer with malevolent intent? How could those accustomed to the measured pace of agricultural seasons comprehend the savage urgency of siege warfare, where death comes not in the clean clash of battle, but in the slow agony of starvation and disease? And yet, perhaps this ignorance was a blessing, for had they known what truly awaited them, would they have had the courage to take even the first step? Sometimes the greatest journeys begin, not with full knowledge, but with a leap of faith into the unknown, trusting that the path will reveal itself as we walk it. one step at a time. The truth is that these men and women were about to become the unwitting agents of one of history's great transformations, though they could not have known it as they trudged along dusty roads, their feet already beginning to blister, their supplies running low, their initial enthusiasm beginning to fade into something harder and more determined. They thought they were going to reclaim the Holy Land for Christendom, but they were actually going to change Europe forever, opening channels of trade and cultural exchange that would reshape the very foundations of Western civilization. In the darkness of a tent pitched beside some nameless river, as the embers of cook fires died to glowing ash, and the sound of snoring rose and fell like a gentle tide, perhaps some of them lay awake and wondered what they had gotten themselves into. Perhaps they thought of home, of familiar faces they might never see again, of comfortable beds and warm hearths that seemed as distant as the stars wheeling overhead. Perhaps they whispered prayers into the darkness, asking not for glory or treasure, but simply for the strength to continue when the morning came. But morning always came, and with it the need to pack up their meager belongings, to shoulder their burdens once again, to fall into line with the great procession that stretched ahead and behind as far as the eye could see. They were no longer simply knights or peasants or merchants, but something new, something that had never existed before in the world, crusaders, bound together by common purpose and common faith, carrying within themselves the seeds of change that would bloom in ways they could never have imagined. As they walked, the familiar landscape of Europe gradually gave way to something stranger, more exotic, more challenging to their assumptions about how the world should be. The food began to taste different, seasoned with spices that made their tongues tingle and their minds reel with new sensations. The architecture evolved from the solid, defensive structures they knew to something more graceful and elegant, with arches that seemed to soar toward heaven, and decorative patterns that spoke of mathematical principles they had never encountered. And slowly, almost without realizing it, they began to change. The narrow certainties they had carried from their homeland started to crack and crumble under the pressure of new experiences, new ideas, new ways of seeing the world. They were still Christian knights and faithful peasants, but they were becoming something more, citizens of a larger world than they had ever imagined possible. This transformation did not happen all at once. Of course, it unfolded gradually, like a flower opening its petals to the sun, revealed in moments of wonder and revelation scattered like jewels along the long road to Jerusalem. Perhaps it came to the knight the first time he saw Constantinople rising from the waters of the Bosphorus like a vision from a dream, its great dome catching the morning light and holding it like a captured star. Perhaps it came to the peasant the first time he tasted coffee, that bitter black brew that seemed to carry within it all the mysteries of the East. Or perhaps it came in quieter moments, in the space between heartbeats when the familiar world fell away, and they found themselves standing on the threshold of the infinite, surrounded by possibilities they had never dared to imagine. These were the moments when they ceased to be simply Europeans and became citizens of the world, when their horizons expanded beyond the boundaries of their birth, and they glimpsed, however briefly, the vast tapestry of human experience of which they were but single threads. The road eastward was long and hard, marked by suffering and loss, by moments of triumph and stretches of despair that seemed to go on forever. Many who began the journey would never see its end, their bones bleaching white under foreign suns, their names forgotten by all but God. Yet even these unknown dead played their part in the great drama that was unfolding, their sacrifice becoming part of the price paid for the transformation of a continent. For those who survived to see the walls of Jerusalem rising before them, like a mirage made solid, the moment must have been overwhelming in its intensity. Here at last was the goal toward which they had struggled for so long, the holy city itself, its ancient stones warmed by the same sun that had shone on Christ and his disciples 1,000 years before. Yet even as they prepared for the final assault, could they have imagined that their victory would be only the beginning, that the real conquest would be not of territory but of their own minds and hearts? The Crusades, we now understand, were many things to many people. They were a religious war and a colonial adventure, a pilgrimage and a business opportunity, a quest for spiritual salvation and a grab for worldly power. They were all of these things, and none of them, a complex human drama that defies simple categorization, just as the men and women who participated in them defy simple understanding. What we can say with certainty is that they changed everything. The Europe that existed before 1095 was a very different place from the Europe that emerged after the last Crusader stronghold fell in 1291. The transformation was not just political or economic, but cultural and intellectual, a fundamental shift in how Europeans saw themselves and their place in the world. The spices that had seemed so exotic in the markets of Antioch, would eventually become commonplace in European kitchens, transforming not just the taste of food, but the entire structure of international trade. The architectural innovations glimpsed in Hagia Sophia would inspire the soaring Gothic cathedrals that still grace European cities today. The Arabic numerals and mathematical concepts encountered in Cordoba and Cairo would revolutionize European scholarship, making possible advances in science and engineering that would have been unthinkable in the closed world of the early Middle Ages. But perhaps most importantly, the Crusades changed how Europeans thought about themselves and their relationship to the wider world. No longer could they imagine themselves as the sole inheritors of civilization, surrounded by barbarian darkness. They had seen with their own eyes the great cities of the East, had walked through libraries that dwarfed anything in Europe, had encountered levels of learning and sophistication that challenged their most basic assumptions about the nature of the world. This knowledge was not always comfortable. It forced them to confront the possibility that their way of life, however familiar and dear, was not the only way, perhaps not even the best way. It opened up questions that were easier to leave unasked, doubts that were safer to leave unexplored. Yet once opened, these doors could never be fully closed again. The genie was out of the bottle, and European culture would never be quite the same. As the centuries passed and the memory of the Crusades faded from living memory into legend, what remained was not so much the specific details of battles won and lost, but the larger transformation they had wrought. Europe had been awakened from its long medieval sleep, had been forced to acknowledge that it was part of a larger world, connected by invisible threads to civilizations and cultures it had barely known existed. The knights who had set out from their castles with such high hopes and simple faith had accomplished something far greater and more lasting than the conquest of the Holy Land. They had conquered ignorance, had pushed back the boundaries of the known world, had opened channels of communication and exchange that would eventually reshape the globe. In seeking salvation in a distant land, they had found something perhaps even more valuable, the knowledge that the world was vast and strange and wonderful beyond their wildest dreams. And so, as we drift deeper into the embrace of sleep, let us remember these restless souls who answered the call of adventure when it came to them across the centuries. Let us honor their courage and their curiosity, their willingness to leave behind everything familiar and comfortable in pursuit of something greater than themselves. They were flawed and human, driven by mixed motives and limited understanding, yet they played their part in the great drama of human progress with dignity and determination. Their story is our story, for we are all heirs to the world they helped to create, a world where horizons have expanded beyond measure, where the exotic has become familiar, where the dreams of one age become the realities of the next. In the end, perhaps that is the greatest legacy of the Crusades, not the kingdoms they founded or the battles they fought, but the reminder that human beings are capable of extraordinary transformation when they dare to venture beyond the boundaries of the known. Sleep now, and dream of roads that stretch toward distant horizons, of cities that shimmer in the desert heat, like visions from another world, of the eternal human hunger for discovery that drives us ever forward into the unknown. For in the end, we are all crusaders of a sort, seeking our own Jerusalem in the landscape of dreams, following paths that wind through the territory of the heart, toward destinations we can only imagine, but never fully reach. From the dust and dreams of distant pilgrimages, let us now turn our attention closer to home, to the very heart of medieval Europe, where another kind of spectacle was unfolding in the lists and tournaments that dotted the landscape like jewels scattered across a tapestry of green fields and ancient stones. Here, in the measured space between castle walls and common ground, a different sort of transformation was taking place, one that would capture the imagination of generations and define our understanding of what it meant to be noble in an age when nobility was earned at the point of a lance. The joust, in its earliest and most primitive form, was little more than controlled violence, a way for warriors to practice the deadly arts they would need in actual combat, while providing entertainment for those who watched from the sidelines. Picture the scene as it might have appeared in the late 11th century, a muddy field churned by the hooves of heavy war horses, the air thick with dust and the smell of sweat and leather, the crude wooden barriers that separated the combatants, barely sufficient to prevent the chaos that always threatened to spill over into the watching crowd. In those early days, there was little of the refined pageantry that would later characterize the sport. Knights charged at each other with a brutal simplicity of purpose, their lances real weapons of war, their armor designed for protection rather than display. The goal was straightforward: to unseat one's opponent, or failing that, to inflict enough punishment to demonstrate superior skill and courage. Death was not uncommon, and serious injury was virtually guaranteed for anyone who made the sport a regular pursuit. Yet, even in this rough and dangerous form, there was something about the joust that spoke to deeper currents in the medieval psyche. Here was conflict reduced to its purest essence, stripped of the confusion and chaos that characterized actual warfare, transformed into something approaching art. 2 men, 2 horses, 2 lances, and the question of who would prove superior when the moment of contact arrived with the sound of thunder and the crack of splintering wood. As the decades passed and the sport evolved, what emerged was something far more sophisticated than those early violent encounters. The joust became a theatre of honor, a stage upon which the highest ideals of medieval society could be displayed and celebrated. The crude wooden barriers gave way to elaborate tilts, carefully constructed to channel the energy of the charge while minimizing the risk of catastrophic collision. The simple leather armor of the early participants was replaced by specialized equipment designed specifically for the sport, offering protection while allowing for the athletic movement required for effective competition. But perhaps most importantly, the joust became infused with meaning that transcended the merely athletic. No longer were knights simply testing their skill at arms. They were performing a ritual that embodied all the values their society held most dear. Courage, certainly, but also courtesy, generosity, loyalty, and that most elusive of medieval virtues, honor. The lists became a place where these abstract concepts could be made visible, where the invisible bonds that held medieval society together could be celebrated and reinforced through pageantry and display. The transformation of the joust from brutal practice to refined spectacle reflects a larger transformation taking place in medieval society itself. As Europe gradually became more settled and civilized, as trade flourished and cities grew, as learning spread and culture became more sophisticated, there was a corresponding refinement in the way violence was understood and practiced. The naked aggression of the early medieval period gave way to something more subtle and complex, a system of values that sought to channel martial energy toward higher purposes. This was the age that gave birth to the code of chivalry, that elaborate system of ideals that governed the behavior of the medieval nobility and continues to influence our understanding of honor and courtesy to this day. The joust became one of the primary means by which these ideals were taught and reinforced, a living lesson in what it meant to be truly noble in the fullest sense of the word. Consider the elaborate ritual that surrounded a formal tournament by the height of the Middle Ages. The preparation alone could take weeks, as craftsmen worked to construct the lists, to erect the pavilions that would house the competing knights, to prepare the feasts that would celebrate both victory and honorable defeat. Heralds traveled throughout the realm proclaiming the date and location of the tournament, inviting knights to come and test their skill, ensuring that word reached every castle and manor house where young men dreamed of glory. The knights themselves prepared with equal care, commissioning new armor from the finest smiths, training their horses to perfection, designing heraldic displays that would announce their identity and lineage to all who saw them. This was not merely about physical preparation, it was about spiritual and emotional preparation as well, about readying oneself to embody the highest ideals of one's class and culture in front of an audience that included not just peers but also the larger community of which they were a part. On the day of the tournament, the entire social order of medieval Europe would be on display. The greatest nobles occupied the best seats, their banners and emblems a riot of color against the pale canvas of the pavilions. The lesser nobility filled the remaining positions according to strict protocols of precedence that reflected generations of tradition and carefully maintained hierarchy. Even the common people had their place, gathered beyond the formal seating areas to cheer for their favorites and to witness displays of skill and courage that would be talked about for years to come. The pageantry began before the first lance was ever leveled. Knights would parade before the assembled crowd in procession, their armor polished to mirror brightness, their horses caparisoned in silk and gold, their personal banners streaming in the wind like prayers made visible. The heralds would announce each participant, reciting his lineage and his achievements, reminding the audience of the noble blood that flowed in his veins and the great deeds that had been accomplished by his ancestors. This was theatre in the truest sense, but theatre with deadly serious purpose. Each knight who rode in procession was not just representing himself, but his entire family line, his feudal obligations, his place in the great chain of being that connected earth to heaven in the medieval worldview. To fail in the lists was not just personal embarrassment, it was a failure that reflected on everyone and everything he was supposed to represent. The ladies, too, played their essential role in this elaborate drama. Seated in places of honor, they were not merely passive observers, but active participants in the creation of meaning that surrounded the joust. Their presence transformed what might otherwise have been simply an athletic competition into something approaching a religious ritual, a celebration of the relationship between masculine strength and feminine virtue that lay at the heart of courtly culture. The tradition of carrying a lady's favor into battle, whether a scarf, a glove, or some other personal token, added another layer of meaning to the proceedings. Now, the knight was not just fighting for his own honor, but for the honor of the woman who had chosen to associate herself with his cause. Her reputation was as much at stake as his own, and the symbolic relationship between them created bonds of obligation and expectation that extended far beyond the boundaries of the tournament ground. When the moment finally came for actual competition to begin, the tension that had been building throughout the day of preparation and ceremony would reach its peak. The competitors would take their positions at opposite ends of the list, their lances at rest, their horses prancing with barely controlled energy. The herald would make the final announcement, the trumpet would sound, and then there would be nothing but the thunder of hooves on turf and the narrowing distance between two men who had committed themselves to a collision that would test everything they claimed to be. The actual moment of contact lasted only an instant, but it was an instant that could change lives, reputations, even the course of history itself. The spectators would hold their breath as the knights thundered toward each other, their lances dropping into attack position, their horses stretching out in full gallop. The sound when the lances finally met their targets was like the crack of lightning, followed immediately by the crash of armored bodies hitting the ground or the triumphant shout of a knight who had maintained his seat, despite the tremendous impact. In that instant, careers were made and broken. A clean hit that shattered a lance against an opponent's shield, while the striker maintained perfect form and balance, could establish a reputation that would last a lifetime. Conversely, a fall from one's horse, particularly if it appeared to result from poor horsemanship rather than the skill of one's opponent, could destroy years of careful reputation building in the space of a heartbeat. But the joust was about more than just winning and losing. It was about the manner in which one won or lost, about maintaining dignity under pressure, about demonstrating the qualities of character that medieval society valued above all else. A knight who fell but who immediately rose and saluted his opponent, who showed no sign of anger or resentment at his defeat, who congratulated the victor with genuine grace and courtesy, could actually enhance his reputation even in defeat. Similarly, a victor who showed humility in triumph, who helped his fallen opponent to his feet, who deflected credit for his success to his training or his equipment or simple good fortune, demonstrated the kind of character that made him worthy of the victory he had achieved. The joust was as much a test of character as it was a test of martial skill, and those who understood this distinction were the ones who truly mastered the sport. The development of specialized equipment for jousting reflects the evolution of the sport from practical training to refined entertainment. The lances used in tournaments were quite different from those employed in actual warfare, designed to break cleanly upon impact rather than to penetrate armor and cause injury. The coronals, or lance heads, were blunted and shaped to distribute the force of impact over a wider area, reducing the likelihood of serious injury while still providing a satisfying crash when contact was made. The armor too evolved to meet the specific needs of the sport. Jousting armor was often heavier and more elaborate than battlefield equipment, designed to absorb the tremendous impact of a lance strike while allowing the wearer to maintain his seat in the saddle. Special attention was paid to the helm, which bore the brunt of many lance strikes, and needed to be both protective and properly balanced to avoid creating blind spots that might prove dangerous in the crucial moments of the charge. The horses used for jousting were bred and trained specifically for the sport, selected for their strength, their courage, and their ability to maintain a straight course at full gallop, despite the noise and excitement of the tournament ground. These destriers, as they were called, were as much athletes as their human partners, and their training was every bit as intensive and specialized. A good jousting horse was worth a fortune, and the bond between knight and mount was recognized as one of the keys to success in the lists. The rules that governed formal jousting became increasingly elaborate as the sport matured, reflecting both the desire to ensure fair competition and the need to minimize the very real dangers inherent in the activity. Points were awarded for various types of successful strikes, with the highest scores going to those who could shatter their lances cleanly against their opponent's shield while maintaining perfect form and balance. Striking certain areas, such as the horse or the opponent's legs, was forbidden and could result in disqualification. The role of the heralds in maintaining these rules and ensuring fair play cannot be overstated. These were men of learning and integrity, thoroughly versed in the complex protocols that govern tournament competition. They served as referees, judges, and ceremonial officials all in one, and their decisions were rarely questioned. The presence of respected heralds at a tournament was one of the things that distinguished a formal, legitimate competition from the informal and often dangerous melees that continued to take place at the fringes of respectable society. As the sport reached its peak in the 14th and 15th centuries, the tournaments themselves became increasingly elaborate spectacles that could last for days or even weeks. The greatest tournaments were sponsored by royalty or the highest nobility, and no expense was spared in creating displays that would dazzle participants and spectators alike. Temporary cities would spring up around the tournament grounds, complete with pavilions for the competitors, lodging for spectators, markets for merchants, and all the infrastructure necessary to support what were essentially medieval festivals. The cultural impact of these great tournaments extended far beyond the world of the knightly class. The poems and songs that celebrated famous jousters and memorable competitions helped to spread the ideals of chivalry throughout medieval society, creating models of behavior that influenced everyone from merchant to peasant. The pageantry and ceremony associated with the joust provided templates for other forms of public celebration, influencing everything from coronations to religious festivals. The tradition of courtly love, which became such a central part of medieval literature and culture, was intimately connected with the world of the tournament. The image of the knight performing feats of skill and courage in honor of his lady became one of the defining motifs of medieval romance, and the reality of tournament competition provided a setting where such ideals could be acted out in public. The relationship between martial prowess and romantic devotion that characterized so much medieval literature had its roots in the very real world of the tournament ground. Yet, for all its pageantry and ceremony, the joust remained a fundamentally dangerous activity. Despite all the specialized equipment and elaborate rules, knights continued to suffer serious injuries and even death in tournament competition. The most famous casualty was Henry II of France, who died from injuries received when a lance splinter penetrated his visor during a tournament in 1559. His death sent shockwaves throughout European society and marked the beginning of the end for jousting as a popular aristocratic pastime. The decline of jousting was due to several factors beyond the obvious dangers involved. Changes in military technology and tactics made the heavily armored cavalry charge less relevant on actual battlefields, reducing the practical value of tournament training. The rise of professional armies meant that fewer nobles were expected to serve as warriors, eliminating one of the primary justifications for maintaining such an expensive and dangerous sport. Perhaps most importantly, the cultural values that had sustained the joust were giving way to new ideals that emphasized different forms of achievement and recognition. The Renaissance brought with it a renewed interest in classical learning and culture, and the elaborate medieval ceremonies that had surrounded the joust began to seem old-fashioned and even barbaric to intellectuals who prized wit and learning over martial prowess. The growth of trade and commerce created new forms of wealth and status that did not depend on military service, and the merchants and bankers who were becoming increasingly important in European society had little interest in maintaining traditions that celebrated values they did not share. By the 16th century, jousting had largely retreated from its position as the premier aristocratic sport to become a curiosity, maintained more for its historical associations than for any practical purpose. The great tournaments that had once drawn competitors and spectators from across Europe became increasingly rare, replaced by other forms of entertainment that reflected the changing tastes and values of European society. Yet the cultural impact of the joust did not disappear with the decline of the sport itself. The ideals of chivalry that had been so closely associated with tournament competition continued to influence European culture long after the last lance was broken in earnest competition. The literature of the later Middle Ages and the Renaissance is filled with references to jousting and chivalric ideals, and the image of the knight in shining armor remains one of our most powerful symbols of medieval culture. The joust also left its mark on the development of European art and architecture. The great halls where tournament victors were celebrated influenced the design of palace and castle construction, while the heraldic displays that were so important a part of tournament pageantry became a permanent part of European visual culture. The skills developed by armorers and craftsmen in creating specialized tournament equipment contributed to advances in metallurgy and engineering that had applications far beyond the world of sport. Perhaps most importantly, the joust represented one of the earliest examples of sport as spectacle, of athletic competition transformed into entertainment for a mass audience. The techniques developed for organizing and presenting tournaments, for managing crowds and creating dramatic excitement, for balancing the needs of participants and spectators, provided models that continue to influence the organization of sporting events to this day. In its heyday, the joust embodied everything that medieval society most admired: courage, skill, honor, courtesy, and the willingness to risk everything for the sake of reputation and principle. It was a world where abstract ideals could be made concrete, where the invisible bonds that held society together could be celebrated and reinforced through ritual and ceremony. It was a world where individual excellence could flourish within a framework of tradition and community, where personal achievement and social responsibility were seen not as competing values, but as complementary aspects of a single ideal. As we reflect on this vanished world from the perspective of our own time, we might wonder what we have lost in the transition from a culture that valued honor above safety, that celebrated risk-taking and personal courage, that understood the connection between individual excellence and communal celebration. We might ask ourselves whether our own forms of entertainment and competition capture the same sense of meaning and purpose that characterized the medieval tournament, whether our athletes and competitors embody the same ideals of character and deportment that were expected of the medieval knight. But perhaps such comparisons are unfair, reflecting different times and different needs rather than simple decline or progress. What we can say with certainty is that the joust represents one of humanity's most successful attempts to transform violence into art, to channel aggressive impulses toward constructive purposes, to create meaning and beauty from activities that might otherwise be merely destructive. The knights who rode in the lists were heirs to a tradition of violence that stretched back to the earliest days of human civilization, yet they had found a way to transform that tradition into something noble and inspiring. They had taken the brutal realities of warfare and shaped them into a sport that celebrated the highest human qualities while providing entertainment and instruction for entire communities. In doing so, they created something that was both uniquely medieval and timelessly human, a perfect expression of their culture's values and aspirations. As the echoes of hoofbeats fade into the distance and the dust of the tournament ground settles into memory, let us carry with us the image of these mounted warriors thundering toward each other in their moment of testing, their lances steady, their courage unwavering, their commitment to honor absolute. Let us remember that they were not just seeking victory, but seeking to embody ideals that were larger than themselves, to become worthy of the traditions they had inherited, and the expectations placed upon them by their communities. In the end, perhaps that is the greatest lesson of the joust, that human beings are capable of transforming even the most basic and primitive of activities into something beautiful and meaningful, that the pursuit of excellence and the commitment to high ideals can elevate any endeavor, no matter how humble its origins. The knights of the medieval tournament knew that they were not just competing for prizes or applause, but for something far more valuable: the right to be counted among those who had lived up to the highest standards their culture could conceive. Sleep now, and dream of the thunder of hooves on turf, of lances glinting in the afternoon sun, of banners streaming in the wind like prayers made visible. Dream of a world where honor was earned, rather than inherited, where courage was tested in open competition, where the pursuit of excellence was understood to be its own reward. For in the end we are all knights of a sort, tilting at our own windmills, seeking our own form of honor in the lists of daily life, measuring ourselves against standards that challenge us to be better than we are. The voice from the sacred chasm, mysteries of the Delphic Oracle. As the tournaments of medieval Europe fade into the mists of memory, let us journey further back through the corridors of time, leaving behind the thunder of hooves and the clash of steel to discover an older and perhaps more mysterious form of human encounter with the divine. We travel now to ancient Greece, to a place where mountains pierce the sky like prayers made stone, where the earth itself was believed to breathe with the voice of the gods, where for nearly 1,000 years pilgrims came seeking answers to questions that haunted their days and troubled their dreams. High on the southern slopes of Mount Parnassus, where eagles circle on thermals that rise from sun-warmed stone, and the silvered leaves of olive trees shimmer in the eternal Mediterranean light, there stood a sanctuary that claimed to be nothing less than the center of the world. This was Delphi, the sacred precinct of Apollo, god of light and music, of prophecy and healing, of all those aspects of existence that lift humanity above the merely animal and point toward something higher, more refined, more touched with the divine spark that makes life worth living. The very landscape seems designed to inspire awe in those who approach it. The road winds upward through terraced hillsides where grapevines and olive trees create patterns of green and silver that shift and change with the movement of the sun across the sky. The air grows thinner and clearer as one climbs, carrying with it the scent of wild herbs and the distant suggestion of pine forests that crown the higher peaks. And always there is the sense of ascending not just through physical space but through layers of meaning, approaching something that exists at the intersection of earth and heaven, of human longing and divine mystery. Ancient travelers making this pilgrimage would have felt the change in atmosphere long before they reached their destination. The very stones of the mountain seemed to vibrate with accumulated centuries of prayer and supplication, with the hopes and fears of countless souls who had made this same journey in search of guidance for decisions that would shape not just their own lives, but the destinies of cities and nations. This was not merely a place of worship but a place of power, where the invisible forces that govern human existence were believed to manifest themselves in ways that mortals could understand, however imperfectly. At the heart of this sacred landscape stood the Temple of Apollo, its columns rising like frozen music against the backdrop of stone and sky. But it was not the temple itself that drew pilgrims from across the ancient world. It was what lay within its most sacred chamber, the Adyton, where a woman known as the Pythia sat upon a bronze tripod and spoke words that could change the course of history. The selection of this woman was itself a process shrouded in mystery and significance. She was chosen not from among the nobility or the learned, but from the common women of Delphi itself, as if to emphasize that divine inspiration recognizes no earthly hierarchy. The transformation that occurred when an ordinary woman became the Pythia was understood to be complete and irreversible. She ceased to be simply herself and became instead a vessel through which the god could speak to mortals, a living bridge between the world of humanity and the realm of the divine. The rituals surrounding her preparation were elaborate and deeply meaningful, each step designed to purify not just her body but her spirit, to prepare her to receive the overwhelming presence of the god without being destroyed by it. She would bathe in the icy waters of the Castalian spring, whose flow was believed to carry with it the power of inspiration itself. She would fast and pray, removing herself from the ordinary concerns of daily life, so that her mind might become clear and receptive to influences beyond the material world. On the days when the oracle functioned, the temple would fill with an atmosphere of expectation so intense it was almost tangible. Priests would perform the necessary sacrifices, ensuring that the omens were favorable, and that Apollo was willing to speak through his chosen vessel. Petitioners would wait in nervous anticipation, knowing that they were about to hear words that might determine whether they went to war or remained at peace, whether they founded colonies in distant lands or remained safely at home, whether their personal decisions would lead to prosperity or disaster. The chamber where the Pythia received her visions was designed to heighten the sense of otherworldliness that surrounded the entire proceedings. Lit only by flickering torches that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, heavy with the smoke of burning incense, it existed in a state of perpetual twilight that seemed to belong neither fully to day nor to night, but to some liminal space between the worlds. The bronze tripod on which the Pythia sat was itself a work of art, its 3 legs shaped like serpents in memory of the python that Apollo was said to have slain when he first claimed this place as his own. Here, in this sacred darkness, the transformation would take place. The ordinary woman who had entered the chamber would breathe deeply of the mysterious vapors that were said to rise from a fissure in the earth itself, vapors that carried with them the very breath of the god. Her consciousness would begin to alter, her awareness expanding beyond the boundaries of normal human perception, until she became something more than merely human, a conduit through which divine knowledge could flow into the world of mortals. The words that came from her lips in this altered state were rarely clear or straightforward. Apollo, it seemed, preferred to speak in riddles, in ambiguous phrases that could be interpreted in multiple ways, in prophecies that revealed their true meaning only after the events they foretold had already come to pass. This ambiguity was not seen as a flaw, but as evidence of the oracle's authenticity, for surely divine wisdom was too vast and complex to be contained within the narrow confines of human language. The priests who attended the Pythia served as interpreters of these cryptic utterances, shaping the raw material of divine inspiration into responses that petitioners could understand and act upon. This was a delicate and crucial role, requiring not just linguistic skill but deep understanding of political and social currents, the ability to craft prophecies that would be both meaningful to those who received them and true to the divine will that had inspired them. Consider the most famous of all Delphic prophecies, the one given to Croesus, the fabulously wealthy king of Lydia, when he asked whether he should wage war against the rising power of Persia. The oracle's response was characteristically enigmatic. If Croesus crosses the river, a great empire will fall. The king, confident in his own power and wealth, interpreted this as a promise of victory over his enemies. Only after his devastating defeat did he understand that the empire destined to fall was his own. This prophecy exemplifies everything that made the Delphic Oracle both fascinating and frustrating to those who consulted it. The words were technically accurate, for a great empire did indeed fall when Crusades crossed the river and attacked Cyrus of Persia, yet they were also profoundly misleading, if interpreted with the kind of linear thinking that mortals naturally employ when trying to understand their circumstances. The oracle had spoken truth, but it was a truth that transcended ordinary human logic, that operated according to principles that only became clear in retrospect. This quality of retrospective clarity was one of the things that made the oracle's reputation virtually unassailable. No matter how events unfolded, it was always possible to look back and see how the prophecy had been fulfilled, even if its meaning had been completely misunderstood at the time it was given. This created a feedback loop that reinforced belief in the oracle's power, for every apparent failure could be reinterpreted as success once the proper perspective was achieved. The influence of the Delphic Oracle on ancient Greek culture and politics cannot be overstated. Major decisions of war and peace, the founding of colonies, the enactment of laws, the establishment of religious festivals, all were undertaken with the blessing and guidance of Apollo as channeled through his priestess. The sanctuary became the unofficial capital of the Greek world, the place where disputes were settled, alliances formed, and the great questions of the age debated through the medium of divine revelation. City-states competed fiercely for the oracle's favor, constructing elaborate treasuries along the sacred way that led to Apollo's temple, filling them with offerings of gold and silver, precious works of art, and trophies from military victories. These treasuries served multiple purposes. They honored the god, they displayed the wealth and power of the cities that built them, and they served as a form of insurance, creating goodwill that might translate into favorable prophecies when crucial decisions needed to be made. The political implications of oracular pronouncements could be enormous. When the oracle endorsed a particular course of action, it carried with it the full weight of divine sanction, making opposition not just unwise but impious. When Athens received the famous wooden walls prophecy during the Persian Wars, the interpretation offered by Themistocles, that the wooden walls referred to the city's navy, provided the divine authorization needed to convince the Athenian people to abandon their city and fight the decisive battle at sea. Yet the oracle's influence extended far beyond the realm of high politics, into the most intimate concerns of ordinary people. Individuals sought guidance on questions of marriage and career, on matters of health and family, on the moral dilemmas that arise in every human life. For these petitioners, the journey to Delphi was not just a practical attempt to gain useful information, but a spiritual pilgrimage, an opportunity to connect with divine wisdom and to place their personal struggles within a larger cosmic context. The process of consultation was carefully regulated and surrounded with ritual significance. Not everyone could simply appear at the temple and demand an audience with the Pythia. Priority was given to certain cities and individuals who had earned the right of pramantia through their service to the sanctuary or their generous offerings. Others had to wait their turn, sometimes for days or weeks, adding to the sense of anticipation and the feeling that what they were about to receive was precious beyond measure. When their moment finally came, petitioners would present their questions in as clear and specific terms as possible, often writing them down to ensure that they were properly communicated to the priestess. Yet even the most straightforward questions seemed to elicit responses that required careful interpretation, as if the divine preferred to guide rather than to command, to suggest rather than to dictate, to offer possibilities rather than certainties. The ambiguous nature of oracular responses served several important functions. It protected the oracle from accusations of failure when events did not unfold as expected, but more importantly, it forced those who received prophecies to take personal responsibility for their interpretation and implementation. The gods, it seemed, were willing to offer guidance, but the ultimate responsibility for decision-making remained with mortals. This preserved human agency, while still providing the comfort and authority that came from divine sanction. The physical setting of the oracle consultation was designed to maximize its psychological impact. The adytone was separated from the main temple by a curtain or screen, so that petitioners could hear the Pythia's voice without seeing her directly. This added to the sense of mystery and otherworldliness, creating the impression that the words they heard were coming not from an ordinary woman, but from some supernatural source beyond normal human experience. The role of vapors rising from a chasm in the earth became a central part of the oracle's mystique, explaining how an ordinary woman could be transformed into a conduit for divine communication. Modern archaeological investigation has revealed that the temple was indeed built over intersecting geological faults that could have released ethylene gas. which in low concentrations can produce euphoria and a sense of dissociation that might be interpreted as divine possession. Yet whether the vapors were real or legendary matters less than their symbolic function in explaining how the impossible became possible, how the divine could speak through the human. The Pythia herself remains one of the most enigmatic figures in ancient history. We know almost nothing about the individual women who served in this role, for their personal identities were completely subsumed into their religious function. They became in effect anonymous vessels for divine communication, their humanity dissolved into their sacred role. This anonymity was essential to their function, for it emphasized that the words they spoke came not from their own minds but from the God who possessed them. The training and preparation required to become an effective oracle must have been considerable, though the details have been lost to history. The Pythia needed to master not just the techniques of entering trance states, but also the art of speaking in the kinds of ambiguous, poetic language that characterized authentic prophecy. She needed to develop an understanding of political and social currents that would allow her utterances to be both meaningful and relevant to those who consulted her. Most importantly, she needed to cultivate the kind of spiritual sensitivity that would allow her to serve as a genuine channel for divine inspiration. The decline of the Delphic Oracle was as gradual and complex as its rise to prominence had been. As the political landscape of the ancient world changed, as new religions gained influence, as rational philosophy began to challenge traditional forms of religious authority, the oracle's role gradually diminished. The rise of Christianity was particularly damaging, for the new religion viewed pagan oracles as demonic deceptions rather than authentic communications from the divine. By the 4th century CE, the oracle had fallen silent, its sacred fires extinguished, its prophecies no longer sought by those who faced difficult decisions. The temple fell into ruins, its treasures looted, its sacred precincts overgrown with weeds and wild olive trees. Yet the memory of what had happened there refused to die, preserved in literature and legend, in philosophical speculation and historical record. The legacy of the Delphic Oracle extends far beyond its immediate historical context. It represents one of humanity's most sustained and successful attempts to institutionalize the search for wisdom, to create a formal mechanism through which the deepest questions of existence could be addressed. The oracle acknowledged that there are aspects of reality that transcend ordinary human understanding, that the universe operates according to principles that can be glimpsed but never fully grasped, that wisdom often comes in forms that challenge rather than confirm our existing assumptions. The famous maxims inscribed at the entrance to Apollo's temple, "Know thyself, and nothing in excess," continue to resonate with seekers of wisdom in every age. They suggest that true knowledge begins with honest self-examination, that wisdom consists not in accumulating information, but in understanding one's proper place in the larger scheme of things. These insights were not unique to ancient Greece, but the oracle gave them a particular focus and intensity that has influenced Western thought for more than 2 millennia. The oracle also pioneered techniques for dealing with uncertainty and ambiguity that remain relevant to anyone who must make important decisions with incomplete information. By refusing to provide simple answers to complex questions, by forcing petitioners to participate actively in the interpretation of prophecy, by acknowledging that truth often comes in paradoxical and challenging forms, the oracle developed approaches to wisdom that transcend the specific religious and cultural context in which they originated. Perhaps most importantly, the Delphic Oracle represents one of the most successful attempts in human history to create a space where the sacred and the secular could meet and interact. Here, in this mountain sanctuary, the practical concerns of daily life, questions of war and peace, of marriage and career, of personal and political decision-making, were brought into contact with the deepest spiritual insights of ancient culture. The result was a form of wisdom that was both thoroughly practical and profoundly spiritual, both immediately relevant and timelessly meaningful. As we contemplate this vanished institution from the perspective of our own time, we might wonder whether we have lost something essential in our transition to a more rational and scientific worldview. The oracle offered something that pure reason cannot provide, the sense that our individual lives and decisions matter on a cosmic scale, that there are sources of wisdom beyond our own limited understanding, that the universe itself has a stake in the choices we make. This does not mean that we should return to seeking guidance from vapors and trance states, but it might suggest that we need to find new ways of acknowledging the limits of rational analysis, new institutions for addressing the questions that science and logic cannot answer, new approaches to decision-making that honor both the demands of reason and the deeper intuitions that guide human behavior at its best. The Pythia, who sat upon her bronze tripod, in the sacred darkness of Apollo's temple, was more than just a fortune teller or a primitive psychiatrist. She was a symbol of humanity's eternal search for meaning, a reminder that the most important questions we face cannot be answered through purely rational analysis, a bridge between the world of practical concerns and the realm of ultimate values that give life its significance. In her mysterious utterances, in her willingness to serve as a vessel for wisdom greater than her own understanding, in her dedication to a calling that required the complete surrender of personal identity, she embodied an ideal of service that transcends the specific religious context in which it was expressed. She represents the possibility that human beings can become channels for wisdom that exceeds their individual limitations, that we can serve purposes larger than our own self-interest, that the deepest truths about existence often come to us in forms that challenge rather than confirm our existing beliefs. As the sacred vapors disperse and the bronze tripod grows cold in the abandoned temple, as the pilgrims' footsteps fade from the sacred way, and the treasuries crumble into ruins, let us remember what was lost when the oracle fell silent. It was not just a source of prophecy but a symbol of humanity's relationship with mystery, a reminder that the most important aspects of existence cannot be reduced to simple formulas or easily understood explanations. The questions that drove ancient pilgrims to climb the mountain path to Delphi are the same questions that drive us today. How should we live? What choices will lead to fulfillment rather than regret? How can we distinguish between wisdom and mere cleverness? What is our proper relationship to forces beyond our control? These questions have no easy answers, but the oracle reminds us that they are worth asking, that the search for wisdom is itself a sacred endeavor, that the willingness to acknowledge mystery is the beginning of all genuine understanding. Sleep now, and dream of mountain paths that wind upward towards sacred mysteries, of bronze tripods gleaming in torchlight, of voices that speak truths too deep for ordinary language to contain. Dream of the eternal human hunger for guidance and meaning, of the courage required to ask the hardest questions about existence, of the wisdom that comes not through easy answers, but through the willingness to live with questions that have no final resolution. For in the end, we are all pilgrims on the road to Delphi, seeking our own form of oracle in the landscape of the heart, listening for voices that speak to us from sources deeper than conscious thought, trying to decipher the messages that come to us in dreams and sudden insights and moments of unexpected clarity. The sacred circle of life, medieval motherhood, and the eternal dance of generations. From the rarefied atmosphere of divine prophecy and the mysterious communications between gods and mortals, let us now descend once more to the most fundamental and universal of human experiences, the one that connects all ages and all cultures in an unbroken chain of love and sacrifice, hope and heartbreak, triumph and loss. We turn our attention to the women of medieval Europe, to the mothers who carried within their bodies the future of their world, who faced the ultimate test of courage, not on battlefields or in tournament lists, but in the intimate darkness of birthing chambers, where life and death met in a struggle as old as humanity itself. To understand medieval motherhood, we must first understand the world in which these women lived, a world where the boundary between life and death was far thinner than it is today, where every pregnancy was an act of faith, every birth a victory against odds that would seem overwhelming to modern sensibilities. This was a time when medicine was more art than science, when the care of women in childbirth depended more on tradition and intuition than on systematic knowledge, when survival often seemed to depend as much on divine intervention as on human skill. The medieval woman approaching motherhood entered a realm that was both intensely physical and profoundly spiritual, where the biological process of bringing new life into the world was understood to be inseparable from larger questions of divine will, family honor, and social obligation. Her body was not seen as belonging entirely to herself, but as a vessel for the continuation of bloodlines, the preservation of property, the fulfillment of dynastic ambitions that stretched backward into ancestral memory and forward into an uncertain future. Yet within this framework of social expectation and religious duty, there existed spaces for the most profound human emotions, for love that transcended calculation, for joy that no amount of hardship could entirely extinguish, for grief that cut to the very core of being. Medieval motherhood was not simply a biological function or a social role, but a complete way of being, a transformation of identity that touched every aspect of a woman's existence. The journey toward motherhood began long before conception, embedded in the very structure of medieval society that saw marriage and childbearing as the natural and inevitable destiny of womankind. Young girls were raised with the understanding that their primary purpose in life would be to bear and raise children, to serve as links in the great chain of being that connected each generation to those that came before and after. This was not seen as limitation but as calling, not as burden but as honor, not as constraint but as opportunity to participate in the greatest of all creative acts. The preparation for this role began in earliest childhood, as girls learned from their mothers, grandmothers, and other female relatives the skills they would need to manage households, to care for children, to navigate the complex web of relationships that defined medieval family life. They learned not just practical skills but emotional ones, the ability to find strength in the face of loss, to maintain hope when circumstances seemed desperate, to provide comfort and stability for others even when their own world seemed to be crumbling around them. Marriage, when it came, was rarely a matter of personal choice, but rather a carefully calculated alliance between families, designed to advance economic interests, to strengthen political connections, to improve social standing. Yet within these arranged relationships, genuine affection often developed, and even where love was absent, there could be respect, partnership, and shared commitment to the welfare of the children who would inevitably follow. The moment when a woman first realized she was carrying a child marked the beginning of a transformation that would continue for the rest of her life. In a world without reliable contraception, pregnancy was both expected and inevitable, arriving with the regularity of the seasons, shaping the rhythm of women's lives in ways that are difficult for us to imagine today. Each pregnancy meant not just the possibility of adding another child to the family, but also the renewal of all the hopes and fears that accompanied the precarious business of bringing new life into an uncertain world. The physical challenges of medieval pregnancy were compounded by a lack of understanding about nutrition, hygiene, and prenatal care that seems almost incomprehensible from our modern perspective. Women continued to work throughout pregnancy, often performing heavy physical labor right up until the moment of birth. They had little access to the foods that we now know are essential for healthy fetal development, and their understanding of what behaviors might harm their unborn children was limited by the medical knowledge of their time. Yet medieval women were not entirely without resources. The accumulated wisdom of generations of mothers, passed down through oral tradition, provided guidance on everything from diet during pregnancy to techniques for managing labor pain. Midwives, women who had dedicated their lives to attending births, carried with them knowledge gained through years of experience, understanding of herbal remedies, and intuitive grasp of the birthing process that often proved more effective than the theoretical knowledge of university-trained physicians. The approach of childbirth was marked by elaborate preparations that reflected both practical needs and spiritual beliefs about the significance of what was about to occur. The birthing chamber would be prepared with special care, cleaned and blessed, furnished with religious images and sacred relics believed to offer protection to mother and child. Female relatives and friends would gather, creating a community of support that transformed what might otherwise be a terrifying ordeal into a shared experience, a celebration of women's power to bring forth life even in the face of mortal danger. The process of labor itself was understood to be a test, not just of physical endurance, but of spiritual strength, a time when women were believed to be especially close to the divine, when their suffering could be understood as participation in the cosmic drama of creation itself. The pain of childbirth was not seen as simply unfortunate, but as meaningful, connected to the biblical account of Eve's punishment and to the larger pattern of sacrifice and redemption that defined Christian understanding of human existence. Midwives played a crucial role, not just as medical attendants, but as spiritual guides, helping laboring women to understand their pain as part of a larger divine plan, encouraging them to call upon saints and angels for assistance, reminding them that their suffering was temporary, while the joy of successful birth was eternal. These women carried with them not just practical knowledge, but emotional wisdom, the ability to provide comfort in extremity, to maintain hope when hope seemed impossible, to transform agony into triumph through the sheer force of their presence and skill. The moment of birth, when it finally came, was understood to be a moment of profound spiritual significance, a time when the veil between worlds grew thin, when divine intervention might manifest itself in miraculous ways. The first cry of a newborn child was heard not just as evidence of successful delivery, but as a voice joining the great chorus of creation, adding its note to the symphony of existence that had been playing since the beginning of time. Yet even in moments of greatest joy, medieval mothers could never entirely escape awareness of the fragility of what they had accomplished. Infant mortality rates that would shock modern sensibilities meant that every child who drew breath was precious beyond measure, every day of survival a victory against odds that seemed calculated to break the hearts of those who dared to love. The statistics are staggering. In some regions and periods, as many as half of all children born would not survive to adulthood, claimed by diseases that have since been conquered, by malnutrition, by accidents that seem preventable in retrospect but were simply part of the fabric of medieval life. This constant awareness of mortality created a particular quality of love between medieval mothers and their children, intense and desperate, shot through with recognition that every moment together was a gift that could be withdrawn without warning. It was a love that had to be strong enough to encompass not just joy but profound grief, not just hope but the constant possibility of devastation, not just the pleasure of watching children grow and develop, but the agony of laying them to rest in graves that seemed impossibly small. The care of infants in the medieval world required skills and knowledge that have largely been lost to modern parents, who take for granted the medical interventions and technological aids that make child-rearing so much safer and more predictable today. Medieval mothers had to become experts in reading the subtle signs that indicated whether their children were thriving or declining, learning to distinguish between minor ailments that would resolve on their own and serious conditions that required immediate intervention. Breastfeeding was not just the preferred method of infant nutrition, but often the only viable option, creating bonds between mothers and children that were both physically and emotionally intense. For women of the nobility, the choice to use wet nurses reflected not indifference to their children, but recognition of social obligations that made personal nursing impractical, though this choice came with its own set of anxieties about the quality of care their children would receive from others. The daily routine of caring for infants was shaped by beliefs about child development that reflected medieval understanding of human nature and divine purpose. Swaddling, which to modern eyes might seem restrictive and uncomfortable, was believed to be essential for proper physical development, providing the support and security that newborns needed to grow strong and straight. The elaborate rituals surrounding baptism reflected not just religious obligation, but parental anxiety about children's spiritual welfare, the need to ensure that souls were protected even if bodies proved vulnerable. As children survived infancy and began to grow, medieval mothers faced the challenge of preparing them for lives that would be fundamentally different depending on their gender and social class. Sons destined for military service needed to develop courage, strength, and skill with weapons, while daughters needed to learn the domestic arts that would enable them to manage households and raise children of their own. Yet, within these gender-specific expectations, there was room for individual differences, for the recognition that each child was unique and would require particular forms of guidance and support. The education of children was understood to be primarily the responsibility of mothers, at least in the early years when fundamental patterns of behavior and belief were established. This was not simply a matter of teaching practical skills, but of transmitting values, of sharing the wisdom accumulated through generations of experience, of preparing young minds to understand their place in the larger scheme of existence. Medieval mothers were the primary repositories of cultural knowledge, the living links between past and future, who ensured that traditions would survive even when political and social institutions failed. The challenge of disciplining children required medieval mothers to balance competing demands of love and authority, affection and instruction, understanding and firmness. They had to prepare their children for a world that would often be harsh and unforgiving, while somehow preserving their essential humanity, their capacity for joy and wonder, their ability to form meaningful relationships with others. This required a particular kind of strength, not the dramatic courage displayed on battlefields, but the quiet persistence needed to shape character day by day, year by year, through countless small decisions and interactions. For noble mothers, the stakes of child-rearing extended far beyond personal satisfaction to encompass political and dynastic considerations that could affect the fate of kingdoms. The sons they raised might become kings. The daughters they educated might form marriages that would determine the course of history. Every lesson taught, every example set, every moment of guidance provided carried with it implications that rippled outward through the complex networks of medieval society. Yet even among the nobility, motherhood remained fundamentally personal, grounded in the same emotions and instincts that drove peasant women to sacrifice everything for their children's welfare. The love between medieval mothers and their children transcended social boundaries, creating bonds that were recognized as sacred by everyone who witnessed them, regardless of their own position in society's hierarchy. Peasant mothers faced challenges that were different in degree, if not in kind, from those confronted by their noble sisters. They had to raise children while working in fields and tending animals, managing households with minimal resources, finding ways to provide adequate nutrition when food was scarce and uncertain. Their children became contributors to family welfare, at ages that would seem shocking to modern sensibilities, taking on responsibilities that helped ensure survival, but that also represented lost childhood, opportunities for play and exploration that had to be sacrificed to necessity. Yet, peasant childhood was not without its pleasures. Archaeological evidence suggests that even the poorest families found ways to provide their children with toys and games, with moments of pure joy that helped balance the harsh realities of medieval life. Folk traditions preserved songs and stories specifically designed for children, creating a shared cultural heritage that helped define group identity and transmitted important values from generation to generation. The seasonal rhythm of agricultural life provided a natural framework for family activities, creating cycles of work and rest, of scarcity and plenty, that helped children understand their connection to the natural world and their dependence on forces beyond human control. Harvest festivals and religious celebrations offered opportunities for communities to come together, for children to interact with their peers, for families to strengthen bonds that helped them survive the difficulties that were never far away. The reality of high child mortality rates created a particular psychology among medieval mothers, a complex mixture of hope and resignation, of fierce protective love and necessary emotional distance. They had to love their children intensely enough to provide the care and attention needed for survival, while somehow protecting themselves from the devastation that would follow if their efforts proved insufficient. This required a kind of spiritual strength that is difficult for us to imagine, the ability to pour oneself completely into the care of beings whose continued existence could never be taken for granted. The death of a child was perhaps the greatest tragedy that could befall a medieval mother, yet it was so common that every woman expected to face it multiple times during her reproductive years. The ways in which medieval society helped mothers cope with such losses reveals both the depth of human compassion and the practical necessity of moving forward, despite heartbreak. Religious beliefs about the afterlife provided comfort, suggesting that children who died in infancy went directly to heaven, freed from the sins and sufferings that awaited those who lived longer. Yet theology could not entirely heal wounds that cut to the very core of being, could not replace the physical presence of children who would never again laugh or cry, or simply exist in the world. The frequency of child loss also created its own forms of practical adaptation. Mothers sometimes gave multiple children the same name, ensuring that family names would survive, even if individual children did not. Burial practices reflected both the intensity of parental love and the necessity of accepting what could not be changed, creating rituals that honored the dead while allowing the living to continue their own lives. The speed with which mothers typically became pregnant again, after losing a child, reflected not indifference to their loss, but recognition that the creation of new life was the best response to the reality of death. Medieval mothers also had to navigate the complex emotional terrain created by the social expectation that they would produce male heirs, while simultaneously forming deep attachments to daughters whose futures were often uncertain. In noble families, daughters represented both precious assets who could be used to form valuable marriage alliances and potential liabilities whose marriages might strengthen rival families. For peasant families, daughters represented future help with domestic work, but also additional mouths to feed when resources were already stretched thin. The relationship between medieval mothers and their adult children was shaped by social structures that often separated families for extended periods. Sons sent away for military training or education, daughters married into distant families, economic pressures that forced family members to seek their fortunes in far-off places. All of these factors meant that medieval mothers had to learn to love from a distance, to maintain emotional connections across physical separation, to find satisfaction in their children's success, even when it meant permanent separation from those they had raised with such care and sacrifice. Yet when circumstances allowed, medieval families could be remarkably close-knit, with multiple generations living in proximity, sharing resources and responsibilities, creating networks of mutual support that helped individuals survive crises that might otherwise have proven overwhelming. The wisdom of experienced mothers was highly valued, their advice sought on everything from medical treatment to marriage negotiations, their presence in households providing stability and continuity that helped families weather the storms of medieval life. The religious dimension of medieval motherhood provided both comfort and additional burden, offering divine sanction for maternal sacrifice, while creating expectations that few women could hope to meet. The cult of the Virgin Mary provided a model of perfect motherhood that was both inspiring and impossible to emulate, creating a standard against which all real mothers inevitably fell short. Yet Mary also served as intercessor, the divine mother who understood the particular struggles faced by earthly mothers, who could be appealed to for help in childbirth, for protection of children, for strength to continue when strength seemed exhausted. The prayers and rituals associated with pregnancy and childbirth created frameworks of meaning that helped medieval women understand their experiences as part of a larger divine plan, their suffering as participation in the cosmic drama of redemption, their success in raising children as service to God Himself. These beliefs provided comfort in times of distress but also created additional pressure, the need to maintain faith even when faith seemed inadequate to the challenges being faced. Medieval mothers were expected to be not just nurturers but moral teachers, responsible for shaping their children's character in ways that would prepare them for earthly success and eternal salvation. This required them to master complex theological concepts, to understand the difference between venial and mortal sins, to provide guidance on ethical questions that had no easy answers. They had to model virtue while remaining human, to teach by example while acknowledging their own imperfections, to inspire their children to reach for moral excellence while preparing them for a world where such excellence was rare. The economic dimensions of medieval motherhood were inseparable from its emotional and spiritual aspects, as mothers struggled to provide for their children's material needs while somehow maintaining the kind of emotional environment in which healthy development could occur. For wealthy families, this might mean managing complex household economies, supervising servants, ensuring that resources were allocated in ways that supported both immediate needs and long-term family interests. For poor families, it often meant making agonizing choices about how to distribute inadequate resources, which children would receive the little food available, which needs could be met, and which would have to be ignored. The seasonal cycles that governed medieval life created particular challenges for mothers, who had to find ways to provide adequate nutrition during winter months when fresh food was unavailable, to keep children warm when fuel was expensive and scarce, to maintain family morale during periods when survival itself seemed uncertain. These challenges required not just practical skills but emotional strength, the ability to project confidence and hope even when the future seemed bleak, to maintain family unity when external pressures threatened to tear relationships apart. The integration of work and family life that characterized medieval society meant that children were exposed from an early age to the realities of economic survival, learning through observation and participation the skills they would need as adults. This created opportunities for close parent-child relationships, but also meant that family relationships were always colored by economic necessity, that expressions of affection had to be balanced against demands of productivity and efficiency. Medieval mothers had to be entrepreneurs of survival, constantly seeking new ways to supplement family income, to reduce expenses, to take advantage of opportunities that might improve their children's prospects. They might engage in textile production, food preparation, small-scale trading, or any number of other activities that could be performed while simultaneously caring for children and managing households. This required remarkable versatility and resourcefulness, the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances while maintaining focus on long-term family welfare. The social networks created by medieval women were essential to their success as mothers, providing systems of mutual support that helped families survive crises that would have been overwhelming if faced alone. These networks operated through formal institutions like guilds and religious organizations, but also through informal relationships between neighbors, friends, and relatives who understood that their own welfare depended on the welfare of the community as a whole. The exchange of services, resources, and information through these networks created a kind of insurance system that helped protect families against the uncertainties that were always present in medieval life. Mothers shared knowledge about childcare, provided assistance during childbirth, offered temporary homes for children whose parents were unable to care for them, created safety nets that helped ensure community survival even when individual families faced disaster. The cultural legacy of medieval motherhood extends far beyond the immediate historical period in which it existed, shaping attitudes and expectations about family life that continue to influence modern society. The idealization of maternal sacrifice that characterized medieval culture established patterns of thought and feeling that persist today, creating both positive models of selfless love and problematic expectations that burden contemporary mothers with impossible standards. The integration of spiritual and practical concerns that characterized medieval motherhood offers insights that may be valuable for modern parents struggling to balance competing demands on their time and attention. Medieval mothers understood intuitively what modern psychology has confirmed scientifically, that children need not just physical care but emotional nurturing, not just material provision but meaningful connection to larger purposes and values that give life significance. The acceptance of loss and uncertainty that was forced upon medieval mothers by the harsh realities of their time may offer wisdom for contemporary parents who struggle with anxieties about their children's welfare that would have seemed luxurious to women who faced the daily possibility that their children might not survive to adulthood. This is not to minimize the legitimate concerns of modern parents, but to suggest that medieval mothers' ability to find joy and meaning despite constant uncertainty might offer models for emotional resilience that could benefit families today. The community-centered approach to child-rearing that characterized medieval society contrasts sharply with the individualistic assumptions that shape modern family life, suggesting that the isolation experienced by many contemporary mothers might be addressed through the creation of new forms of mutual support and shared responsibility for child welfare. Medieval mothers understood that raising children successfully required the cooperation of entire communities, that no individual parent could provide everything children needed for healthy development. As we reflect on the lives of these long-dead women who faced challenges that seem almost unimaginable from our modern perspective, we can recognize in their struggles and triumphs the eternal patterns of human love and sacrifice that connect all mothers across time and culture. Their willingness to risk everything for the sake of their children, their ability to find hope in the face of seemingly impossible odds, their dedication to nurturing life, even when life seemed fragile beyond belief. These qualities represent something essential about human nature that transcends the particular circumstances of any historical period. Medieval motherhood was not just a biological function or a social role, but a complete way of being, a form of love so deep and fundamental that it shaped every aspect of existence. These women understood something that our modern world sometimes seems to have forgotten, that the creation and nurturing of new life is not just a personal choice, but a sacred responsibility, not just an individual decision, but a contribution to the continuation of human civilization itself. In their quiet courage, in their daily acts of service and sacrifice, in their willingness to find joy in the midst of sorrow and hope in the face of uncertainty, medieval mothers embodied virtues that remain as relevant today as they were 1,000 years ago. They remind us that the most important work in any society is often done by those who receive the least recognition, that the foundation of all human achievement is the love of mothers who dedicate their lives to ensuring that the next generation will have the opportunity to build upon what has come before. As we prepare to take our own rest, let us remember these women who knew so little rest themselves, who faced each day with the knowledge that their vigilance might mean the difference between life and death for those they loved most deeply. Let us honor their memory by recognizing the mothers in our own time, who continue their work, who face their own challenges with similar courage and dedication, who represent the living continuation of a tradition as old as humanity itself. Sleep now, and dream of lullabies sung in languages long forgotten, of hands that comforted crying children through countless nights, of love that transcended the boundaries of time and mortality, to create bonds that death itself could not break. Dream of the eternal dance of generations, of mothers and children and grandchildren, stretching back through time like links in an unbroken chain, each generation carrying forward the gifts received from those who came before while adding their own contributions to the great human story that continues to unfold around us. For in the end, we are all children of these medieval mothers, inheritors of their courage and their love, recipients of the sacrifices they made to ensure that life would continue, despite all obstacles. Their stories live on in us, in our capacity for love and sacrifice, in our willingness to nurture life even when life seems fragile, in our understanding that the future depends on the care we provide for those who come after us. They are not just figures from history, but our ancestors in the truest sense, the women who made our own existence possible, through their willingness to face the unknown for the sake of love. And so we have journeyed together through the mists of time, from the dusty roads of medieval pilgrimage, to the thundering hooves of tournament grounds, from the sacred vapors of ancient oracles, to the intimate chambers where life itself began, each story weaving into the next like threads in a tapestry, whose pattern reveals itself only when viewed from the proper distance. These are not merely tales of distant ages, but echoes of the eternal human drama that continues to unfold around us in every moment, in every choice we make, in every dream we dare to pursue, despite the uncertainty that surrounds us. The restless nights, seeking meaning beyond the boundaries of their familiar world, the tournament competitors risking everything for the sake of honor, the oracle speaking mysteries that transcend ordinary understanding, the mothers pouring their lives into the nurturing of future generations. All of these figures represent aspects of our own deepest nature, our own ongoing quest for purpose and significance in a universe that often seems indifferent to our struggles. As consciousness drifts toward the realm of dreams, let these ancient voices continue their whispered conversation in the chambers of sleep, where time becomes fluid, and the boundaries between self and other, between past and present, between the possible and the actual, dissolve into the greater mystery from which all stories emerge, and to which they eventually return. In the darkness behind closed eyes, let the sound of distant hoofbeats carry you toward your own tournament of dreams, where honor is still possible and courage still matters, where the ancient codes of chivalry translate into modern forms of integrity and service. Let the oracle's ambiguous wisdom guide you through the labyrinth of sleep, where riddles find their own solutions and prophecies fulfill themselves in ways that conscious thought could never anticipate. Most of all, let the loving presence of countless generations of mothers surround you with the knowledge that you are never truly alone, that the chain of care and sacrifice that brought you into being continues to sustain you even in the deepest night, that somewhere in the great web of existence, someone has always been keeping watch, ensuring that the flame of life continues to burn despite all the forces that would extinguish it. Sleep deeply and dream well, knowing that you are part of a story larger than any individual life, a story that began before memory and will continue long after our own small part has been played. In the morning, when you wake refreshed and renewed, you will carry within you the wisdom of ages, the courage of knights, the insight of oracles, and the love of mothers, ready to face whatever challenges await, with the knowledge that you are heir to the greatest treasures humanity has ever possessed, the capacity for wonder, the hunger for meaning, and the willingness to keep seeking even when the path ahead is shrouded in mystery. For now, rest in the peace of knowing that all seekers eventually find what they are looking for, that all questions eventually receive their answers, that all love eventually finds its home in the heart that is open enough to receive it. The ancient stories will keep their vigil while you sleep, and in the morning they will still be there, waiting to accompany you on whatever new adventures life may bring.